Hello everybody, good afternoon. It's Judith Lipp here at the Trek office in Toronto. Thank you for joining us for the Power of Community webinar. This is an opportunity for us to share a recent report an economic analysis that we conducted to better understand the impact that community-owned renewable energy is having in the province of Ontario. And just before we get started, I want to just introduce a few people and also just go through a couple of protocol issues around just using the webinar. So with me is Daria Taran, who has been working with Trek and the People Power Planet project. He's going to go through a couple of housekeeping details, and then the other presenter today is Brett Dolter, who is going to talk about the economic analysis, and I'll give a more fulsome introduction when he's up. So just to start, a couple of, whoops, one second. Just a couple of issues related to navigating the GoToWebinar. Daria?
Hello everyone. So if you have not used the GoToWebinar program before, it's actually pretty straightforward. So as you probably have noticed, you will begin the webinar muted. And please keep it that way unless you're speaking in a discussion period. And I can actually go ahead and unmute you myself. So you don't have to worry about that either. And please use the questions tab. You're going to notice a questions tab, and please use it only for technical issues. And please use the chat tab for discussion-related questions and comments only. So if you want to ask something about the presentation and about something that relates to the research that we're presenting, please use the chat tab and use the questions tab only for technical issues such as I can't hear you, I can't see my screen, or I can't unmute myself. And if you have a question, this is of course going to be how you're going to be telling us you want to ask a question in the discussion period. But even before that, please raise your hand. You will notice a little hand on the left hand side of your control panel. Please press that. This way we know that you either want to ask a question or you want to make a comment. So this is going to be especially helpful during the discussion period. And again, if you have any questions regarding what I just talked about, please use the questions tab. And thank you very much. And I'm passing it back to Judy.
All right, great. Thanks, Daria. So yeah, welcome everybody. We've got a really great number of people that have registered from all across the country, actually. So that's very exciting. And as far away as Australia and Turkey and where else?
The UK.
Oh, in the UK, well. Yeah. So we're really excited that there's so much interest in this, in the work that we've been doing, and in community power in general, of course. So just to give you a sense of how our time together will work. So I'm going to present first. I'm going to talk a little bit about who Trek is and the Federation of Community Power Co-ops that also gets referenced in the report. I'm going to give some context for the report itself and why we decided to undertake it, and really sort of looking in at what's happening with energy policy in Ontario. I'm going to talk a little bit about community power and what that means, and then the benefits of community power, but I'm not going to focus on the economic benefits. I'm going to leave that to Brett's economic analysis. Then I'm going to share some poll questions that we undertook here in Ontario to understand, people's attitude towards community power, and then a few policy recommendations that we're sharing with the Ontario government going forward. And then I'll hand it over to Brett to talk about the economic analysis and a short presentation on the methodology for those of you who might be interested in how those numbers were derived, and then we'll have time for question and answer and any kind of discussion that people would like to have. So I'm assuming everything's good, no technical issues. So yeah, I will go through a couple of slides here. So first of all, just wanted to introduce you all to Trek. Formerly stood for Toronto Renewable Energy Cooperative. We've been around since 1998, and certainly we're focused in Toronto initially, but now work very much across Ontario and in different parts of the country to promote community ownership of renewable energy. We've really been a leader in that by building first community-owned wind project and called WindShare. See that in the picture on the right, and then on the left is SolarShare, one of Canada's largest solar co-ops. So we work a lot with the cooperative sector, but we've also been working with Indigenous communities and social enterprises in terms of project development and community member and investment services. What that means is we help groups that are managing community finance and community investments to help find efficiencies and to keep their money secure. We also inform policy through our research and advocacy efforts. So, and that's really, this report is really about that. It's about better understanding the work that we do, about better, and also about promoting community power. And you can see there our vision. So, we believe that people working together can get more done. And if we pool our resources to realize a low carbon economy, we will all benefit from it mutually and have a more democratic system going forward. So that's a little bit about TREC. And then the Federation of Community Power Co-ops is an organization that the renewable energy co-op sector in Ontario formed together in 2012 as a sort of network for sharing resources and experiences, but also to create a common voice when it comes to policy goals and objectives. And you can see, again, some pictures of our members down below. On the far right there, we have a picture of Premier Wynne visiting a solar project owned by Agris Solar Co-op. So, we've definitely been able to get some political attention, but certainly we do need to keep on the government's radar to ensure that we keep traction. And I will talk about that when we get into the recommendations. And then I want to acknowledge, a project like this, it is certainly a collective effort. I just want to acknowledge various individuals and organizations and also funders that helped make this project possible. So in particular, Brett Cundiff from Green Living Communications, who did provide a lot of support in terms of the research and the writing, and then a number of people on the TREC team, and also SolarShare. I want to just do a shout out to SolarShare and the staff that helped dig up the numbers that were used in the analysis. And then finally, the People Power Planet project, which is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, provided financial support of aspects of this project. So thanks to all of those groups and individuals for making this project possible. So moving on to the context, Ontario is at a turning point. The province is about to undergo another long-term energy plan. The previous plan committed the province to continuing the supply of electricity from nuclear power at 50 to 60% levels. There is so far no indication that the government is planning to back off from that level of target. They have already begun to make commitments in terms of nuclear refurbishments, as well as extending the life of certain very aging reactors. And so this is really a concern for us in both the renewable energy sector more broadly, but within community power, because we are at a point where the need for, if we continue to maintain the nuclear fleet, then the need for new renewables is seriously curtailed. And we will ultimately have reached our renewable energy targets that were set in the last long-term energy plan, and we could essentially see not much further action in terms of renewables or community power. And this at a time, I guess, when renewable energy technology is evolving incredibly quickly, and I'll get a little bit into that, certainly from a pricing perspective, but also in terms of just the evolution of the technology and its capabilities. And so we're at a very interesting time in this province where, on the one hand, the energy innovations that are happening around us are really quite astonishing, and we're in a very good position to take advantage of those. But at the same time, we have a government that's very committed to a technology that ultimately, hasn't really demonstrated to be nimble or low cost. And so that is essentially the context in which we're working. There are also some implications, potential implications for carbon emissions if we go that route. And so just to show potentially what would happen if we were not going to be pursuing renewables and building out the gas plants, then in the short term, our carbon emissions would increase as a result. And this, as I mentioned, at a time when the cost of wind and solar in particular is coming down dramatically. And again, you can see the different, just see that impact that the different technologies, you can see the comparison of the cost of wind versus the best case for Darlington. Darlington is one of our nuclear power plants. And again, these numbers do not include things like stranded debt, waste management, or decommissioning. So whereas on the wind side, the companies are certainly responsible for decommissioning. So these numbers aren't entirely comparable. And also just the long lead time and the poor experience we've had in Ontario with nuclear projects being built on time and on budget. So again, these are sort of hopeful numbers, I would say. And then similarly on the just the cost of renewables, you can see just that price point coming down in terms of utility scale solar and wind. And I guess the other really big learning that we've seen in Ontario as we've pursued any number of infrastructure projects, but certainly on the energy side, is that the best way to a low carbon economy is to include communities and individuals. That this issue needs to be tackled as a collective, and communities need to be involved. And community power represents a win-win-win for the province in terms of climate and energy policy, as well as for economic development and community resiliency at a time where we do need to build stronger communities. We see lower revenues available to municipalities, to individual community groups, etc. So we see a real opportunity here. You can see a couple of pictures here. These are some First Nations projects. This is the wind turbine is in Chiging First Nation on Manitoulin Island. They've got three turbine wind project. And then on the right-hand side is the Alderville First Nation 5 megawatt wind solar project. And so it's important that we're involving all communities, that community power is inclusive. And I think the other really big lesson that I wanted to mention is just the experience with the Green Energy Act in Ontario and the opposition in particular to wind projects, but in general, this sort of, sense, often false, that the renewable energy policies are driving up electricity prices. And so the more we can involve individuals and communities in the dialogue, but also allow them to participate through community power, the more likely we are to achieve support, but also direct benefits that communities often are, in desperate need of. So as far as we see it, we certainly think that the way forward is through the development of more community-owned power. And just to make sure that we all understand the definition that we're using community powers refers to the direct participation in and ownership of collective benefits from renewable energy projects. And it's inclusive of different types of owners. And it could be in part or in full, but certainly in Ontario, right now it is driven by the cooperative sector, in part because of the rules in the province, but we certainly also consider nonprofits and other community groups to be part of the community power mix. Certainly First Nations and Métis communities, as well as municipal entities. All of those, we think, should continue to be under the community power umbrella and should continue to be supported in terms of building out projects. Just want to do a shout out to these youth from Kettle and Stony Point First Nation who are on a solar installation program, and really speaks to sort of the jobs opportunities as well, and the training opportunities if the sector can be maintained, and that's really a big part of it. We've had a very cyclical approach to the renewable energy policy in Ontario, which has meant great fluctuations in terms of jobs and industries being able to sustain themselves. So we definitely need that stability going forward. Just a quick diagram on what we see as the community power advantage, and I'll talk a little bit. We will be talking to each of those, so I won't get into them in detail. I'll actually have a future slide about the benefits of community power, but just a representation of that. So these are the benefits that we identified in the report. So the environmental attributes, I think it's really important to note that beyond the carbon, the greenhouse gas emission reductions that are possible through renewable energy because of its very low carbon, and again, we look at that from a life cycle basis. Within the operational phase, there is no carbon emitted from wind and solar projects. There's also much lower extractive impact, so upstream in terms of mineral extraction that we see in the oil and gas sector, as well as in uranium mining. There's very low downstream impacts as well, because most components that go into renewable energy technologies are recyclable. And of course, the big issue in Ontario is the nuclear waste piece, the lack of long-term storage solution, and just the long timelines at which this nuclear waste needs to be managed. So just obviously these are broader benefits of renewable energy more generally, and community power is only a piece of that. So in terms of system benefits, I think it's often not well understood that distributed generation, of which community power certainly is a part, because distributed generation happens closer to the loads and it involves smaller projects, and it essentially reduces the investments needed in new transmission and the maintenance costs from the system stresses. And you can see that in the slide, in the chart below, that in fact, if you consider the transmission costs in the comparison, you can see that it's actually a relatively small scale rooftop system is starting to compete. And certainly once you get into that 500 and 1 megawatt range, these are system sizes that actually can benefit the system. And also, the closer you're generating power to loads, it certainly helps with grid resiliency during extreme events. And we've certainly seen our fair share of those kind of impacts, in Ontario, in terms of ice storms and other system breakdowns. On the community side, community building is certainly a benefit. I think one of the pieces that's really interesting is that community power projects are often a gateway for both climate actions, but also other energy projects. And what we're seeing, we're seeing this amongst the co-ops in Ontario. We've certainly seen this in Germany, which is a leader in community power. And we're seeing it amongst First Nations communities, where individuals and groups start to get involved in energy projects. They begin to build capacity, and as they build that capacity, they are in a much better position to take on new projects. In fact, there's often an eagerness to build on the capacity that's there and to continue to engage either co-op members or community members in different ways, as well as, of course, reaping the benefits of those projects. So I think that's really maybe a little lesser understood benefit of community power, is this capacity building and this sort of deeper action that results. It's also important from a social license perspective. So as individuals and communities get involved in energy infrastructure, they move from being NIMBYs, not in my backyard, to the YIMBYs, which are the yes in my backyard. people, and that's only natural, is that if you're part of a project and you're reaping some of the benefits, especially the economic benefits, then you're going to be more open. But I think the other piece is the control aspect. When individuals and groups are part of a project where they actually have some say, it's going to result in a better project overall and therefore more acceptance. And finally, I think community power is important for creating a level playing field in an industry that's essentially been, really shut out communities and smaller actors overall. It has been dominated by large centralized players, government monopolies, private monopolies, and community power is a way. Renewables, again, the technology lends itself to that distribution, but community power and the policies that support it are specifically enable that leveling playing field. And then the economic drivers, and I'll let Brett get into the numbers, but community investment results in dollars that are reinvested locally. So again, that's just general rule of thumb, and a trend that we see is when communities and individuals, they're going to spend money close to home, and so that can stimulate the local economy. Certainly, it's an important revenue stream for communities, municipalities, landowners, First Nations, other community groups that are, deriving benefit both from, taxes and rents, but also from project revenues. And again, it's a new opportunity. It's the energy sector is one that, is consistently making 10 to 15 to 18% returns. And what we're saying with community power is some of those returns could actually be retained by local communities. And in fact, what we're finding is that is in fact what is happening, and Brett will get into that. There is also a job creation and skills development component, and we do see, other studies have shown this, that there are more jobs created through community power, and again, that skills development that stays local for future projects, and then the economic multiplier piece that Brett will talk about. So I wanted to share what we decided to do, actually, in collaboration with the Federation of Community Power Co-ops, was to understand whether the general public in Ontario was supportive of, and what level of support did they have for community projects. And I think, the community power message has tended to possibly be lost in the media mix, with the sort of anti-wind sentiment, and there's definitely been a strong media push about pricing of electricity and renewables being a cause of that. And so, as much as we've, the Federation and individual co-ops have tried to raise the awareness about community power, it's hard to get our message out with the media that, is very critical and is often looking for, bad news stories. So we decided to do a poll, which we ran at the end of April through an independent polling organization called Ecos Research Associates. And we had these 3 questions that we asked them. So one was, we were trying to understand their support for, how important they thought it was that Ontario increase community ownership of renewables in this province. And that first, the first section is just to provide some context. And so you can see, there's overwhelming support in terms of the very important and somewhat important. So over 78%, expressed support for Ontario continuing this work. And I think that's, certainly a very strong result. In terms of, and then we were curious of what, how those numbers would be impacted from by technology. So we had a question about supporting a wind energy project, whether they would be more or less supportive. And again, you can see here, the numbers indicate that they would be somewhat more supportive of a wind project if it's community owned, and similar numbers and a bit higher for solar. So, of course, I think these are important numbers to show the government that sometimes has this feeling that perhaps we're losing the public relations fight on renewable energy, and obviously to support that community ownership component. So just to put in context what's happening in Ontario, and I have a sort of comparison pie chart here, looking at looking at Ontario compared to Germany, but I wanted to just mention that certainly the work that Trek has done, and I know a number of co-ops, and certainly I think community power in general, are very inspired by the results that Germany has presented in terms of who owns renewable energy in that country. And so you can see here that almost 50% of all renewable energy generation in Germany is owned by citizens and cooperatives. So the citizens are often kind of collectives. It could be a group of farmers. It could be individual homeowners with solar on their rooftops. So quite a wide range, but also there are over 700 renewable energy cooperatives in Germany that have emerged over the last 20 to 25 years since Germany introduced its feed-in tariff program. And you can see the others, the other side of the equation are the energy suppliers, which would be utilities, often utilities and energy companies, and then institutional and commercial developers. We don't have exactly the same breakdown in terms of what we've done is looked at, which projects are owned fully commercially versus by First Nations and Métis communities versus by communities and municipalities. So this is the breakdown we have. So we've got 87% is fully commercial, 10% of projects are First Nation and Métis owned in full or in part, and then 3% by co-ops and municipalities. So while we are definitely leading in North America in terms of community power in Ontario, we're certainly a far cry from what Germany has achieved, but we're also only 5 years into the process. So I think, it's important to keep that into context. So we certainly believe the potential is huge to expand. We'd like to see renewables energy expanded, the ownership expanded to at least 50% by the community power sector. And, it's entirely doable. It's just a question of policy. There's something else I wanted to say on that, but just drawing a blank. I wanted to say a few things. So we've obviously talked about, and we certainly reference Indigenous renewable energy projects as well as municipalities in the report. We don't really have the best data on individual project costs and even ownership patterns. And actually, that was the point I wanted to make with this slide. When we say full or in part, we just don't have very good data that's broken down, neither by co-op, by municipality, or for any of the community power sector to really fully understand, the proportion of ownership and also the way that these projects are being organized as far as like community control. And, then that does vary from one partnership to the next. So that's just the reality that we face, is that the numbers are not sometimes as fully available as we would like to be able to do a proper analysis. However, on the co-op side, it is an area we work in directly, and there are certainly co-op members that have access to and are willing to share the data, and so that's what we use for the economic analysis. But I think the one thing I really like this quote here, and it really speaks to the importance of community power, and this speaks to co-op members, but it's certainly true for any of the community power players, is that essentially communities are investing in the infrastructure in their own communities, and they're using the returns to support their local economy. And this is it's quite a unique situation where you actually have communities raising the money for the projects that are going to serve their needs, and being able to not only benefit in terms of the system benefits and the environmental benefits, but they're also benefiting from the economic returns that result from these projects. And I've said it before, but the energy industry makes, at minimum, 10, but usually more in the 15 to 20% return range. And we're essentially saying community power is asking for a piece of that, and in that communities are in the best position to know what that money is going to be used for. And that's essentially, the key argument that we put forward. Just to sort of do a little shout out for the renewable energy co-op sector. It's seen a massive, quite a significant increase over the last 5 years. Started out with just a handful of co-ops before the Green Energy Act, which was a pivotal policy in North America for renewable energy and for community power. And as much as, there's certainly been criticisms of it, the feed-in tariff program that we have in Ontario has certainly been a game changer for community power. And it has resulted in, almost 1,000 megawatts of community renewable energy in the province. As far as the co-op sector, so the renewable energy co-ops are managing, in terms of their sort of majority ownership, about 75 megawatts projects. They've raised more than 84 million in community capital through shares and bonds, and are developing solar, wind, and biogas projects. So far we're not aware of any co-ops that are developing hydro projects. On the First Nations side, there's certainly quite a few communities involved with hydro projects as well. Again, the co-op sector, they have more than $100 million in assets under management and are paying out more than $9 million per year in returns to investors. And that's, for projects that have been built and that are earning returns to date. So there's still, the portfolio of projects continues to grow. We just had an announcement on the FIT 4. Certainly a number of co-ops have indicated their success in that round. There are still some questions around the economics of those projects given the FIT rates. I'm sorry, I keep using the word FIT, but FIT stands for Feed-in Tariff Program, and it's essentially the policy in Ontario that allows groups to, it defines the price at which a project will be given a contract. There are other criteria, of course, that developers need to meet before their projects will be accepted. But the price point is a really important one, and there are other provisions in the feed-in tariff program that have been instrumental for allowing communities to and different community groups to participate. Lastly, there are more than 7,000 people across Ontario that are members of renewable energy co-ops, and again, this number is growing because we're still the sector is still in a growth phase. And we would like to continue to see all those numbers increase with policies going forward, with supportive policies for this sector. So that's on the co-op side. Amongst the First Nations, there are about 850 megawatts of projects built under FIT in over 30 communities that have been involved. We don't have other breakdowns in terms, it's structured very differently with First Nations communities. They don't use the co-op model, it's organized differently. So we don't necessarily have those economic returns, but certainly what we're seeing is that communities are, again, they start often with one or two small projects, and as they develop capacity, they are able to pursue others. And are, in some cases, are bringing in, new revenue streams that they didn't have access to before. So, this is as a way of sort of wrapping up. We feel that people need to be directly involved in the transition to a low carbon future. and involvement in community power creates a dialogue around energy use that leads to additional actions. And so I want to emphasize that point just because I think it's the piece that often gets lost in this whole discussion of community power benefits. If you're a policymaker and you're trying to understand how to, decarbonize the economy, there's really, few better ways to get people behind a process that involving them directly in it in a way that actually results in economic returns. It's, money does speak, and as I said before, once a community comes together and does, a solar project, they start talking about other projects. They start thinking about getting their members involved in home energy efficiency projects, or in some cases, and again, we've seen this maybe perhaps a bit more in Germany, where communities are really undertaking quite, setting out quite ambitious targets for, 100% renewables in their community within, 2 decades, that sort of thing. And it's that kind of, that level of inspiration and innovation and action that we need to tackle the climate crisis in a way that still feels positive and doesn't feel like a draconian approach, and nor should it be left just to industry and a top-down approach. So that's I guess I can't emphasize that point enough. Particularly those who are on the call who are in that policy making area. There's very few other ways that communities get engaged in energy except through the community power movement. The one thing to remember is these groups are organizing meetings. Often they're organizing events to keep members interested. There's a level of education and energy literacy sort of awareness that gets passed on through that approach that can't really be funded through any other mechanism. So that's a really important point, and we do need that energy and carbon literacy to grow across Canada. So to wrap up on my presentation, I just wanted to share, a little bit on the policy side. So, what's really important is that community power will not work without effective policy, and this is proven over and over again. It's certainly, Ontario is a prime example of that. We saw it in Nova Scotia that has a community feed-in tariff program. We've seen it in Germany, Denmark, the Netherlands. Any number of jurisdictions that have community power have introduced a feed-in tariff program or some kind of community energy contract that recognizes that communities cannot compete with the private sector in terms of energy contracts. And so this notion that communities can participate in a competitive procurement process is essentially false. They cannot. The only way they can participate in a competitive process is through sort of if the policy forces the companies that are bidding to include a community component. But again, the economics there have shown that often the deal is skewed in favor of the industry, and that's because what's driving the procurement process is lowest cost, and so it's a very hard balance to meet, which is how do you supporting community power and getting the lowest cost renewable energy. There's got to be a compromise there, and the feed-in tariff program represents that compromise. Essentially, it says it looks at the equation differently and says how much does a group or community need to earn in order to move projects forward, and then the price is worked out on that basis. And so, I say all that to emphasize the importance in Ontario to maintain the FIT program for qualified community organizations, which includes co-ops, Indigenous nations, and municipalities. There is a risk right now that the FIT 5, which is coming up later this year, will be the last round of the feed-in tariff program. There's also the risk that the feed-in tariff price has been lowered too dramatically to actually allow community groups to have viable projects. There is a higher cost to developing community-based projects because of the level of engagement that these groups do, and because of the longer lead times that are just inherent in these actors kind of coming up to speed. So that's one really critical point, is that we need that FIT program to be maintained. And we also would really encourage the Ontario government to include a FIT program for wind energy. Right now, the only way for community groups to participate in wind is either through micro-scale projects or small-scale projects under 5 kilowatts, which is far too small for a wind project to be viable, or to partner with a commercial developer on a wind project under the large renewable procurement system that has been introduced. Wind has seen the biggest contention across Ontario, and yet there's no mechanism for community groups, or very limited mechanisms for the community groups to actually build wind projects. So that's our second recommendation. We would also like, sorry, I skipped a point there. We'd also like to see the cap for FIT projects raised. So right now, the minimum size project is 500 kilowatts. To help improve the economies of scale, we think projects need to go up to 1 megawatt. And again, it's just a question of, if you're building a project, you've got a lot of fixed costs. And if you can spread those out over a larger size project, you're more likely to be successful. Finally, the fourth point is, this one is specific to co-ops and other community projects. It's specific to the co-op sector because right now there are no provincial loan guarantees for co-ops, and it's very hard for co-ops to access financing. It's quite expensive, or they're just not even accepted because their project sizes are too small. They often don't have enough financial history in terms of running projects, and of course they wouldn't because it's a new sector. So we're in this weird space. There are provincial loan guarantees for Indigenous groups as well as for municipalities for renewable energy projects. We'd just like to see that extended to the co-op sector. And then finally, this is, really we see an opportunity for Ontario to be a leader in developing community power in other parts of Canada, in other parts of North America. We've got the skills, and we certainly have a lot of experiences, and why not expand on that and bring that to other jurisdictions. So those are our recommendations. I want to hand it over now to Brett, who we engaged, I guess it was earlier this year, to help us with the economic analysis. So as I've said before, this hasn't really been done before, in part because we really didn't have, we just didn't have enough experience and access to the numbers that would allow us to do this level of analysis. So we thought we'd give it a try, just to see what would come out. And I think the results, have really been quite favorable. And I'm going to have Brett talk us through his approach, but before I do that, before we hand over the screen, I just want to introduce him. So Brett Dolter is an economist with a PhD, specializing in climate and energy policy research. He's published his work in various journals. He is also the Vice President of Research and Education for the Canadian Society for Ecological Economics. And his PhD dissertation focused on pathways for greening the Saskatchewan grid. So he's got a lot of experience in economic modeling and the energy sector. And so we're really pleased that he was able to work with us on this on the economic impacts component of this project. So I'm going to hand it over to Brett, and then we'll open to questions right at the end, because I think it sort of lends itself to just for us just to carry on.
Over to you, Brett.
Hello. That's
muted.
Thank you. Thanks, Judith, for that introduction. And yeah, I've got a presentation here. It's just 10 slides, but I want to walk people through the methodology I used to come to these conclusions and give you a sense of the results I found. So quick outline of the presentation. I'll talk about the goal of the research. I'm going to show some numbers of a representative solar project, how the numbers break down once you look at installation costs into things like inverters and racking and administration, things like that. Then I'll outline a sort of quick overview of how I went about doing a multiplier analysis to look at how expenditures on community solar projects have these multiplier ripple effects throughout the economy. I'll then go on to talk a bit about induced effects, which is sort of another extension of this multiplier analysis, and then show you some results. So the goal of this work was to calculate the direct and indirect economic impacts of community-owned FIT projects. And so when I say direct impacts, I'm talking about expenditures made on things like the panels, the racking, inverters, installation, the labor for installing the project. Over time, there'll be operation and maintenance costs to keep these things running, sales, marketing, and returns to investors. So all these expenditures that have to be outlaid in order to get a project going and to keep it going until it's the end of its life are these direct impacts. Now, those direct impacts have a multiplier effect, and that's the indirect impact. And so if you buy a racking system for a solar panel, imagine that might be made of something like aluminum. So we could trace back the benefits and the economic activity that's occurred throughout the economy in order to create that racking system. So to create the racking system, the company had to buy some fabricated aluminum. That aluminum fabrication company had to buy maybe some raw inputs from an aluminum company. They bought electricity, and there's this ripple, this cascade of impacts and expenditures that have been made in order to get these components to be available for the project. So if you add all those up, you have this indirect impact. And there's also this induced impact, and that comes when we have wages paid out to laborers, we have returns on investment paid to investors. So this money goes to people and gets put in their pocket, and if they choose to spend it in the local economy, there is another multiplier impact that happens there. So you might spend $1 in the local economy, but there's these rippling cascade effects, and that might mean that you've created $2.50 worth of economic impact. So that's another added economic impact we can look at on top of the direct and indirect impacts. So to look at the direct impacts, I wanted to first start by showing you some numbers on how the installation costs of a representative solar project might break down. And we got these numbers. We worked with folks at Endura Solar to give us a sense of how costs are broken down when you invest in a 500 kilowatt solar project or a 100 kilowatt solar project. And you can see that bottom line, the total dollar per watt. So it's cheaper if you go with a 500 kilowatt project, a bigger project, $1.75 versus maybe $3 per watt if you have a 100 kilowatt project. And the costs, you can see as you go down those two rows, you've got things like mounting, the modules themselves, electrical connections, the inverters, also labor on installation, permitting, engineering to plan this out, and business overhead. So what I've done here is tried to show if you take that dollar per watt figure and break it into its components, identifying what those components are. And that's the first step in doing this economic analysis. So we get the direct costs and the direct impact measured that way, and then we can use that to measure and calculate the indirect impacts. So if we now look at the next step, so we want to take all of these types of expenditures and categorize them. So we've got these North American Industrial Classification System codes and NAICS codes, and so the next step was to match the expenditures to the right NAICS category. So mounting fits with this fabricated metallic products category. Down looking at engineering fits with engineering construction. And this is important because we're going to use it to do the indirect economic impact calculations. Now, once we put these in these categories, need to get an input-output table or a make-use table for Ontario. So for this analysis, I was using the 2011 Ontario make-use table. Here's just a little chunk of that, but those of you familiar with economic analysis might have seen this type of table before. Those of you who haven't, it's basically a table showing the exchange of goods between sectors. And so if we look at a column like, we've got utilities in the final column to the right, it's showing that the utility sector had some inputs in order to create the output in that given year for Ontario. And the inputs included $1.4 billion coming from mineral fuels. So that's the utility sector, could be the power sector as part of that, buying mineral fuels in order to operate things like, at that time, coal before it was phased out. So we use this this table as the basis for the analysis to try to get a sense of what purchases need to be made in the economy in order to produce a given product. So whether it's utilities buying fuel, agriculture buying inputs, in our case it's the solar industry buying the racking, the inverters, the engineering services. Now, just a quick, I won't bore you with this too much, but I used this information in a Leontief analysis. It's an analysis that was created by this economist Vasily Leontief. There's a bit of matrix algebra there in the top right. What it shows us is on the left-hand side, that X vector total, that is total output. So total output equals the Z matrix is the intermediate inputs. These are the inputs required in order to make product plus final demand for final finished goods. With that information, the input-output table gives us that information. We can then do some matrix algebra, rearrange to create this Leontief matrix that becomes this key to the multiplier analysis. So this identity matrix minus A inverted this Leontief matrix. And what that does for us is it relates the direct expenditures related to the solar project, this F vector, to the total output required in the entire economy in order to make those products that were used in the solar project, which is X. So you see this Leontief matrix pre-multiplying the direct expenditures. That's the key to it there. You get this matrix, and when you pre-multiply a given set of expenditures that we found in finding the direct expenditures, the result is total output, which includes the direct expenditures plus indirect economic activity. Now there's this extension to the work where we want to understand the induced impact. So we look at each sector, say X1 is agricultural output required to create a solar project. You might not think you need agricultural output to create a solar project, but down the line of these cascading impacts, you might find that, well, in order for construction to occur, construction companies buy restaurant meals. In order for restaurant meals to be created, restaurant companies buy food from agriculture. So all of these impacts are summarized in the results, the total output results. And so you might have X1, the agricultural sector, the output required for the solar project, and we want to multiply that by this measure of the labor intensity of the industry. So try to understand how much of that cost is going to be wages, and do the same for value added or profit. So try to understand how much of the expenditure on agriculture or engineering construction is paid out as wages for labor or as profit to investors. And again, that money is then used to do the induced analysis. So just to summarize then, get this data on a representative solar project, categorize the expenditures by NAICS code, create the multiplier, the Leontief multiplier, using the make-use tables for Ontario. Then we want to pre-multiply the solar project expenditures by the Leontief to get these total, this measure of total impact, which is the direct and indirect impact total. To do the extension with the induced impacts, we need to understand how much of the total output was paid to labor or paid to investors. So we calculate intensities and calculate how much of that total output was paid to labor or as profit. Then we can calculate the induced impact from that by a simple multiplying total wages by the multiplier impact of spending $1 in the economy on a typical bundle of consumer goods. So there's a few steps there, and when we get through those steps, we get some results. And here's a summary of the key results of the analysis. You can see there's 3 projects listed here: Project A, Project B, Project C. So what I've tried to do is just show the sensitivity of results to different assumptions that can be made in the analysis. You can see they're all assumed to be the same size, about 300 kilowatts. They generate the same amount of electricity. They're paid at a fit rate that's the same, corresponds to the fit rate from 2012 and something close to the weighted average of feed-in tariff rates paid to the solar share projects. But the assumptions that are important here, we look at this first section. You can see Project A doesn't involve local ownership, financing, developer, doesn't have local content in the form of inverters or modules, whereas you get to Project C and all of those things are local. And the results down at the bottom are really what we want to see is, well, for every $1 that's spent through the FIT program supporting a project like a solar share project, we understand how much of economic impact does that have in the Ontario economy. And so Project A, if you don't have a lot of this local ownership or local inverters and modules, you still get an impact greater than that feed expenditure. So you get, for every $1 paid through the feed-in tariff program, $1.40 in economic impact to Ontario. Project B has local ownership, local financing, local developer, but not the locally produced inverters and modules. And it's a sort of a 2-to-1 ratio there. For every $1 spent on a FIT contract, $2 of economic impact circulates then around in the Ontario economy. Now, the bigger impact happens when you get to 100% domestic ownership and this domestic content for inverters and modules. You get up to about 2.5 times the economic impact as what was put in terms of the feed-in tariff revenue paid to the developers. So different arrangements, different financing arrangements, different content in terms of local domestic content have different implications for the economic impacts of a project in Ontario. But as Judith was saying, when you're building these community projects, you are getting this local ownership, likely a local developer. SolarShare works with local developers, and more often than not, you'll get these local inverters and modules. You get them more often than you would in a project made by a big private developer. So you'd see in a community solar type of a model something more like Project C or maybe Project B than Project A. And those are the results we really wanted to highlight in this report, and wanted to have a bit of a calculation of how much economic activity, how much impact is made by these community solar projects. And I'm happy to take questions. I will just send this program back over to Judith.
Unmuted.
Oh, okay, great. Thanks so much, Brett. That's really obviously a very thorough job. And, you know, I don't know that we all need to understand the ins and outs of how these things work, but it is helpful, I think, to understand in general what goes into these economic analyses. And, you know, this method is not unlike what is reported on in, you know, the media on other, you know, sector impact. So I think there's a useful education there. But certainly for us, you know, what's interesting is just to be able to show those concrete numbers and talk in the language and the terminology that the mainstream talks about. Up on my screen, I wanted to just show you is the Trek website, and I will open up after this. I will open up to the discussion, but I just wanted to encourage everybody to, if you're feeling comfortable, what we really want to do is raise the awareness about community power in general. This report is a useful way of doing that. What we've created here on the Trek website is obviously a link to the report itself. We have an executive summary, so you can share that with friends and colleagues. But we also have this Take Action section where we're really encouraging those of you, in Ontario, for those of you who aren't in Ontario but want to influence Ontario policy, we certainly support that as well. There's just a letter that you can send to the Energy Minister, the Premier, and your local MPP. You do obviously have to look up your local MPP. So if you click on that button, it just takes you to a standard letter. It's not showing up right now, but that is what will happen. So there's a language there that you can use. You can cut and paste it into your browser, or there's another link afterwards that will allow you just to open it up in your webmail. The Learn More, we're on that right now, so you're already participating. Thank you for that. And then we do have some social media memes that you can share, through your Facebook and Instagram, so or Twitter. So please, if you feel compelled with the story we're telling, we would love for you to help us spread the word and get more people aware of the impacts and benefits of community power. So that essentially wraps up the presentation portion of our time together. Whoops. So we are moving on to the discussion period, and I'm going to hand it over to Daria just to, again, share with us the protocol, just so that we're using the technology efficiently.
Thank you, Judy. So right before I start, I want to note that this session is actually being recorded, and it's going to be shared with all of the attendees, and also with the potential of being uploaded on YouTube and on our website. So if you have any reservations about that, please let me know in the questions box under the questions tab. So this is just the heads up. So technically, if you want to ask a question or wish to speak, please raise your hand. Again, it's on the left-hand panel on your control panel. And please try and keep your comments and questions to 1 minute. We want to be as inclusive as possible and get as many people as involved as possible. And again, same thing as I outlined in the beginning, please use the chat tab for comments and questions related to the research. Those will be saved, and if we cannot address it now, we will address it after the webinar. And again, if you're facing any technical questions, please use the questions tab. After you raise your hand, I'm going to be able to see it from my end, and I'm going to give the floor to you and unmute you, so you don't have to worry about looking around to unmute yourself and stuff like that. And with that, we'd like to open the floor to questions and comments. So please raise your hand if you wish to speak.
Yes, you have two options. You can raise your hand and speak, or you can also put your comments and questions in the chat tab, depending on.
All right, I see a hand by Gideon Foreman, and Gideon, I'm muting you, and the floor is yours. Go ahead.
So can you hear me okay now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great, thanks. So wonderful presentation. Thanks, Judy, and thanks, Brett. I'm just wondering, is there a role for some direct government relations work here, where those of us in the sector, NGOs and co-ops themselves, meet with government to push government on some of the things that you recommend at the end of the report? Maintaining the FIT for community orgs and raising the capacity cap for FIT projects to 1 megawatt, etc. Is there a role for some direct meetings with government to try to bring these messages home?
Yeah, thanks, Gideon. Absolutely. So the next step, in some ways, this report was motivated also by wanting to have, really strong argument to go to government with. So our intention all along was to roll out a government relations strategy from this report. And so that is the plan through the summer. Of course, we have a new energy minister in Ontario, so we're just giving him and his team a little bit of time to get settled in, but we intend to meet with him. We have already met with Minister Murray, who's the climate change and environment minister, to share some of the results. But yeah, I mean, the more voices that are collective and uniform and united in the messaging, the better chance we have. So certainly I know, Gideon, you're with the David Suzuki Foundation. There are other angos out there that, would like to join us in getting the word out. Part of it is the letter writing campaign and having the government hear from, the general public. But of course, what we also need to do is get those meetings and get the results and the recommendations in front of the right people. So that will be part of our effort through the summer.
Great. Okay. Well, we'd like to be David Suzuki Foundation. We'd like to be a part of that, Judith. So we'll talk offline. But yeah, we certainly support you in this.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gideon. I'm muting you again.
Thanks.
Anybody else? And if people feel like sharing about, their own experiences, community power, or any studies you've seen done elsewhere, certainly all is welcome here. If you don't have questions, you don't have questions. That's absolutely fine.
Okay, I see a hand by Dennis. Dennis, I'm muting you. The floor is yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
How do you respond to critics who say that their hydro bills are high because of subsidies to renewables, in particular focusing on the FIT program?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a fair question, and we do hear it all the time. I guess, then I want to give a nod to Environmental Defence, another NGO here in Ontario that has looked at or commissioned a study actually to look at what are the results, what is the causes of the increase in the electricity prices in Ontario, and only, I think it's 14%, although I'm going to add Brad Cundiff to jump in here if need be, but only less than, I think it's around 14% of the increase in our bills over the last few years are attributable to the feed-in tariff program. Most of the increase in our electricity bills are actually due to just the infrastructure investments that have had to be made in the province. So for a good 20 years, this province has really not invested in modernizing the grid. And those it just came down to a crunch time. So those increases are largely due to factors other than renewable energy. The other response I always give when I hear people call the feed-in tariff program a subsidy is really just to, it's really to clarify that electricity generation has always been developed through this kind of mechanism where there's whoever is developing the power generation needs to know that they're making a certain return on investment. And I referenced this before, that number is often in the 15 to 20% range. It can go down to 10%. But that's how these projects get built. Nobody will do an investment without a return. There's risks involved. There's just costs involved that need to be covered. And so I always object to people calling the feed-in tariff program a subsidy. It is a program that recognizes that this is how new generation gets built. Nuclear power comes in, telling the government what its cost is, and the government, and that's the price. There are those mechanisms with the competitive procurement process that, there is often the belief that will drive down the cost per kilowatt hour. And when the contracts come in, it often appears that will happen. What we have found, though, in many jurisdictions is a lot of those projects don't get built because the competitive process is driving the price down too far that the developers can't build their project. So these are, I'm getting into, obviously, power pricing and sort of some nuances in sort of how this industry works. But that, in short, the answer to the bill question is that the electricity price increases we've seen in Ontario are only in small part attributable to renewable energy generation that we've added. And I guess if you consider at the same time, the shutting down of coal plants that have been possible and the billions of dollars in health costs that have been saved as a result of that action, now, when you're struggling with paying your bill, that probably doesn't help you all that much. And, I do want to also just acknowledge that. I know that there are certainly a large number of individuals and families in Ontario that do struggle with their bills, and I do think there have to be other mechanisms to address that. And again, I think it's a whole other area of energy policy around energy poverty that isn't well managed and talked about in this province.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dennis.
I could just add to that, Judith. This is Brad Cundiff from Green Living Communications. I think we do have to acknowledge that it's very easy for the public to get confused about this. But on the face of it, that when you're paying, 50 cents per kilowatt, that's got to be why my power prices are going up. What people miss is the second part of the equation, which is the rather as opposed to 10 times 10,000 for nuclear or gas, perhaps. And so people, generally they just sort of go to the logic of, well, it's a high price, that must be the problem. So sort of getting people to walk through that math a bit with you. Nobody likes math, but sort of saying to them, what results in the bigger number? 2 times 50 or 10 times 10,000? The second part of it is that the whole FIT program and the Green Energy Act was about much more than just procuring green energy. It was about kickstarting a new industry in a province that had lost 300,000 manufacturing jobs due to a global recession and a high dollar. And it has been quite successful at that, as our colleagues at Environmental Defense have outlined in some of their reporting. So it's a matter of reminding folks about that, too, that this was a dual purpose. It was about starting the transition to low-carbon energy, but it was also about creating a new industry here. And despite international trade rulings that have kind of cut into that advantage, there still is quite a substantial renewable energy industry in Ontario, manufacturing everything from wind turbine towers to solar panels. And I guess the third point is to point out to people the degree to which the FIT program is increasingly acting as a bit of almost a transfer mechanism between governments. So, the federal government has the most taxing power, the provincial government has the next most taxing power, and the municipal governments have the least taxing power. And the provincial government is essentially, in some ways, using the FIT program to steer money to the community. For instance, the Toronto District School Board now has solar panels on over 300 schools. The revenues it is earning from that are paying for its roof repairs that it has no money to pay for in any other way. So otherwise, municipal taxpayers are going to have to dig into their pockets to pay for those roofs. So the FIT program in the last few rounds, particularly from FIT 3 onwards, has heavily favored community, and I use the term community broadly, energy projects, everything from school boards to municipalities to co-ops, to develop these projects locally and to flow money back into the local communities. So yes, it's on the face of it, it's very persuasive that the FIT rates seem awfully high compared to what I'm paying per kilowatt hour, but relative to the benefits out the other end, the rates aren't that high, and the benefits are, as Brett outlined, quite substantial.
Right. Thank you.
See a hand by Wayne Digby. Wayne, actually, I'm having a technical issue. Can you unmute yourself, please? Oh, there we go. Go ahead, Wayne. Floor is yours.
Yeah, I'm with the Manitoba Sustainable Energy Association, And we're looking at working with community economic development people in the province to promote community energy, community power projects. And I just wondered what your experience has been in working with that group of people in Ontario, how you do it, what type of training you provide, etc.
Oh, well, thanks for calling in and joining us. Yeah, it's interesting. I guess things sort of evolved a little bit differently here in that we almost, were running to catch up with the policy once it was introduced. So, I mean, not to suggest that, there wasn't quite some effort amongst the environmental NGOs and different coalition groups in Ontario to help bring in the Green Energy Act. But because we had the policy, the policy was quite favorable off the top. We didn't really build a coalition beyond the co-op sector and the ENGO sector right off the top. It's really now more recently that we've started talking to economic development groups more specifically. So I just think the evolution is different. But I think you're absolutely right in that approach is that, that this policy does, I think what I was trying to illustrate is, it's rare, I think, in government policy to find something that has sort of these, multifaceted benefits that can be addressed through a single policy. And so the more you can bring people under, that umbrella of community power, and you've got different arguments, whether that is, the economics, the resiliency, the climate action, the jobs, obviously the environmental impacts, it's a unique sector in that sense, I feel, or it has been my experience of it. It could just be my limited experience of other sectors, having worked in energy for so long. But yeah, so I don't have sort of a strategic comment on how we did it. What I'm seeing is that the economic development folks are coming to us now saying, oh yeah, we really like, we really get it. We get that economic impact piece, and how can we, how can we support this? In Ontario, it's been more the alignment with the cooperative association. That's been strong from the beginning. And even I would say, that building those alliances between the co-op sector and the Indigenous sector, and even the municipal sector, that is only just starting to happen now. And I think it's partially because we were all, thrown into the policy. There was a lot of, it was a steep learning curve for everybody. There wasn't a lot of time to sort of look around and, and have conversations. There was a lot of sort of getting, trying to get projects, getting contracts applications in and then getting projects built. And now we're at that point, we have a little bit more breathing room, and we're starting to say, okay, how do we keep this going, and how do we do that through a collective effort? So I hope that answers your question.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. I'm muting you again. Anybody else? I don't see any hands for now.
Yeah, we're at 2:21, so we're certainly happy to keep going for another 9 minutes. If anybody has any other comments, questions. But yeah, we don't need to, if people feel like they've gotten all they need out of this process, then we can certainly wrap up early.
Perhaps we'll ask one last time. Give you 10 seconds.
Sure. Okay, well, thank you so much for everybody's participation, for taking time out of your day to participate in this. We're certainly excited that there is so much interest, and I want to thank Brett Dolter very much for his, obviously his hard work on the economic analysis and for the presentation, and to Daria Taran for getting this event organized and helping it go smoothly. And to the entire Trek team and to the Federation of Community Power Co-ops here in Ontario, and everybody that helped, contribute to the report. It's you'll see there's various quotes in there. There's different references to different groups. So it just it's been a huge effort to get to where we are, to about 1,000 megawatts of community power in Ontario. It's a great start, and we really would like to see that just blossom into many more projects and many more benefits that we know are possible. So on behalf of everybody on the team, thank you very much, and we wish you a happy summer, and we hope that you can help spread the message about community power. And feel free to get in touch if if you're working on any projects in your own jurisdictions. I'm always happy to try and give some thoughts and ideas on how to move things forward. Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.